Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. They gave me 10 minutes, which fits usually about how long I can hold the attention of the crowd. And Nicole must have heard me present before because she asked me to trim a few minutes off of that. So I've got about 8 minutes. So I'm going to talk about something that's been near and dear that we've spent about the last 7 or 8 years working on using remote tracking systems to look at the wellness in beef cattle. And primarily we've looked at bovine respiratory disease. So bovine respiratory disease or pneumonia in beef cattle is in the feedlots the primary economic disease that we deal with. So about 85% of all the diseases in the feedlots consist of bovine respiratory disease, and our most common treatment for that is antimicrobial therapy, which you can see is a significant cost. So in 1999 it was $13, it was up to $24 in 2011, and I would hazard to guess that it's probably went up since 2011. That's a pretty small portion of the actual cost of the disease. Besides the actual treatment, you have loss of cattle, you have loss of performance in those cattle, you have cattle that are diagnosed and don't respond to treatment, you've got cattle that weren't diagnosed and thus fall out of production. So the two things we talk about when we're trying to diagnose cattle are false positives and false negatives. So basically it's the accuracy of how well we can identify sick cattle. So your false positives are the cattle that we call sick. We give them antimicrobials. They respond pretty well because they weren't sick anyway. But we wasted, so in regards to antimicrobial stewardship, we gave a dose of antibiotics that was unnecessary. So I think we've talked a lot about the consuming public today. I think the consuming public, I have to believe that most of them, if there's an animal that's truly sick, they want us to treat that animal. But what we need to guard against is using antimicrobials for animals that don't need that treatment. And then our false negatives are the animals that we never identify as sick, so they then don't receive treatment, and like I said, they either are sub-performers or they fall all the way out of production. So our goal was to find a system that we could monitor every calf every day, up to every second every day, and have basically a red light, green light system. So what we wanted to have was a system that I could give to a cowboy that when he came in the morning, it would have a list of the calves that he needed to pull from the pen. So go find calf number 10, calf number 12, their tags flashing and they need pulled for respiratory disease. So what we utilize, and really our technology is more about the algorithms in the system than the actual hardware, but we utilize an active RFID tag that transmits a signal to monitors around the pen, and then using that information, the computer can localize where that calf's at and where he's been. So then with that information, we come up with a series of metrics. So we look at movement of the calf, so distance traveled, speed traveled, look at location of the calf. Is he at the feed bunk? Is he at the water? Is he in the shed? Is he around the outside of the pen? And then our social interactions. So social interactions are utilized a couple of ways. One, we know they're animals of prey, so when they're sick and they're not feeling well, the first thing that they do is they try to hide within the group. So we can look at different interactions, how they look at the group, and then the computer has to be able to look at the interactions of the pen as a whole because of environmental impact of the behavior of those animals. So where I live in northeast Missouri, it can be 50 and sunny today, and 20 and sleet tomorrow, and 10 below zero the next day, and then back to 50. And that greatly affects the movement and the behavior of that pen of calves. So if we look at the industry as a whole, we're not very good at picking out sick cattle. So Dr. Larson opened the gate earlier for jokes about statisticians, and he tells me that about half of us are above average and about half of us are below average. But overall, we're not very good. We're about 60% at being able to pick out a calf that's actually sick. So using our series of algorithms, we can get to about 90%. So 90% of the time we're going to find a calf that's sick, and 90% of the time a calf that we call sick really is sick. Now what we've tried to do is we've tried to back that out, go back a second, tried to back that out to where we don't look at all the metrics, to where we only look at one metric, such as time at the feed bunk, and then what happens is our accuracy falls back to about that of a cowboy. One of the reasons that is if you look at this is a graph that shows the behavior patterns of calves, and when they have high social pressure, so at breakfast time, when the feed wagon rolls through and it's time to go eat, the calf that doesn't feel very good feels pressure to go up and behave like his peers. So he goes ahead and goes to the bunk. And those of us that have had experience walking pens know that they're pretty good at mimicking what the rest of the group does. They may go to the bunk, they may even stick their nose in the bunk and get feed on their nose, but oftentimes they don't eat. But they do a really good job of mimicking what the rest of the group does. Now what you can see is when there is not a lot of social pressure, that's when their behavior starts to differentiate. But by definition, if you're in the pen watching that calf, it's a time of high social pressure. So what we're able to do is we're able to monitor the behavior of that calf when there's not a predator, you, in the pen to change the behavior of that animal. This is just one of a couple series of trials that we've done of data that's out there. One that I thought had some relevant information for today, and that we looked at READY, which is what we call our system, as compared to metaphylaxis. So metaphylaxis is a practice that's used in the beef industry. When we have a group of calves that come in, those southeastern calves we were talking about earlier today, that have a really, really high propensity to get sick, we'll give them blanket antibiotics on arrival because we know, at least we think we know, that we can decrease the morbidity and mortality or sickness and death loss in those calves by about 50%. So we'll blanket treat them off the truck. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to compare our system to metaphylaxis or standard of the industry on those high-risk calves. In the interest of shaving a couple minutes off, I'm going to skip through these slides. If somebody wants to see these later, I'm glad to share them. But for all intents and purposes, statistically, we were the same. Our average daily gain was the same, our number of sick cattle was the same, our first retreats were the same. What was different was the total number of antibiotics that we gave. So remember, the cowboy gave every animal a dose of antibiotics off the truck, and we did not. So in the end, we have the expense of the antibiotics, and we have antibiotic stewardship, the fact that we were able to decrease the usage of antibiotics by 1 full dose per calf. The reason we're able to do that is because, back to the computer being able to monitor those cattle 24 hours a day, it can find those calves at a much earlier time than we can. So common sense would tell me if I can find the calf 2 days before the person would, and I can intervene, I can do a better job of treating that animal. And on a whole, we found about 60% of them 48 hours prior to the cowboy. So that's all I have today. I appreciate your time and hopefully stayed within that 8-minute limit. So.